He thought dismissing her in front of an entire courtroom would make him look powerful, but he had no idea he was seconds away from ending his own career. The courtroom in downtown Chicago buzzed with quiet authority, polished oak benches lined with spectators, the faint hum of whispered conversations bouncing off marble walls, and at the center of it all stood Daniel Brooks, a sharply dressed attorney known for his confidence and his need to control every room he stepped into. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, his silver watch catching the overhead lights as he shuffled through his case files, preparing to impress the judge who had not yet arrived. Then the doors creaked open, and a woman stepped inside. She wore a simple gray cardigan over a white blouse, her hair loosely tied back, her presence almost invisible compared to the polished professionals surrounding her. Evelyn Carter moved quietly, choosing a seat near the front, her posture straight but unassuming, as if she had every right to be there yet no desire to be noticed. Daniel glanced up briefly, his eyes scanning her in a fraction of a second, already placing her into a category he had long mastered, irrelevant. He smirked faintly, returning his attention to his papers, but something about her stillness lingered in his mind like a detail he couldn't quite place. Minutes passed, the room filling, tension building as everyone waited for the session to begin, but impatience had never been Daniel's weakness, arrogance had. He stepped forward, voice cutting through the low murmur. "Ma'am," he called out, loud enough for others to hear, his tone wrapped in polite authority that barely concealed the condescension beneath. "This area is reserved for legal professionals." The room quieted just enough to notice. A few heads turned. Evelyn looked up slowly, her eyes calm, steady, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I'm aware," she said softly. That should have been the end of it, but Daniel wasn't finished. He took a step closer, his shoes echoing against the polished floor, feeding off the subtle attention now gathering around them. "Then I suggest you find a seat in the gallery," he added, a faint smile. Tugging at his lips as if this were a minor inconvenience, he was graciously correcting. A couple of spectators exchanged glances, one or two letting out quiet, awkward chuckles. The air shifted, tension threading through the silence. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply held his gaze, her expression unreadable, her stillness almost unsettling. Daniel felt it, that flicker of something he couldn't name, but instead of stepping back, he leaned into it. "We have procedures here," he continued, his voice firmer now, louder, making sure the room understood who was in control. "And people who don't follow them tend to slow things down." The words landed heavier this time, drawing more attention, more eyes, more quiet judgment. Someone in the back shifted uncomfortably. Another person leaned forward, sensing the moment stretching beyond something ordinary. Evelyn's hands rested calmly in her lap, her breathing even, her posture unchanged. If she felt the weight of the room pressing in, she didn't show it. That, more than anything, irritated him. "I don't want to escalate this," Daniel said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "But if necessary, I can have security assist you." The threat hung in the air, thinly veiled, sharp enough to draw a collective pause from the room. And still, she didn't move. Her eyes remained steady, not defiant, not fearful, just certain. Daniel opened his mouth again, ready to deliver one final remark, one that would seal the moment in his favor, when suddenly the heavy courtroom doors behind him swung open with a sharp echo that cut through everything. The room shifted instantly. A uniformed bailiff stepped inside, his voice clear, authoritative, carrying across every inch of the room. "All rise." Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood, the energy snapping into place like a switch had been flipped. Daniel straightened instinctively, adjusting his jacket, his expression resetting into professional composure, but something felt off. The rhythm was different, the timing wrong, and then he noticed it. Evelyn was still standing exactly where she had been, no longer just a quiet presence in the room, but the center of it. The air tightened. The murmurs died completely. And for the first time that morning, Daniel Brooks felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest as realization began, slowly, mercilessly, to take shape. Daniel Brooks remained standing, but the confidence that once filled his posture began to fracture in subtle ways, like a polished surface revealing hairline cracks under pressure. His eyes followed Evelyn Carter, watching as she stepped forward with calm, measured precision, her presence no longer blending into the background but commanding the entire room without a single raised voice. The bailiff's words still echoed faintly in the air, and every person in the courtroom remained on their feet, yet the silence had changed. It was no longer passive. It was heavy, expectant, almost charged with something unspoken. Daniel's mind raced, trying to reconcile the image he had built of her just moments ago with the reality unfolding in front of him. This did not make sense. It could not. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of his legal folder, the crisp paper inside suddenly feeling irrelevant. Evelyn reached the front of the courtroom, her steps unhurried, deliberate, as if every inch of that space belonged to her. The faint sound of her shoes against the polished floor echoed with a quiet authority that no one could ignore. She turned, not abruptly, but with a controlled grace, facing the room, facing him. And for the first time, Daniel noticed what he had missed before. It was not her clothing, not her simplicity, but her composure. It was the kind of stillness that did not come from uncertainty, but from certainty so complete it required no display. The kind of calm that people spent years trying to achieve and most never did. A realization began to form, slow and relentless, pressing against his thoughts. The judge had not entered the room yet. Or perhaps, Daniel swallowed. The movement barely visible, but it felt loud in his own body. Around him, the subtle sounds of shifting weight, quiet breaths, and restrained curiosity filled the space. No one spoke. No one moved. The room was waiting. Evelyn's eyes moved across the courtroom, not searching, not scanning, but acknowledging. Each person, each presence, each moment. When her gaze returned to Daniel, it did not carry anger or accusation. It carried something far more unsettling. Recognition, as if she had already understood everything he had said, everything he had intended, and had chosen to say nothing. Until now. The clerk, seated to the side, adjusted her papers with a slight tremble in her hands, her earlier certainty replaced with something closer to caution. Daniel noticed it. Others did too. The energy had shifted completely. What had been a moment of control for him had quietly transformed into something else entirely, something slipping beyond his grasp without any visible struggle. Evelyn placed her hands lightly on the bench in front of her, her fingers resting with quiet assurance. The movement was small, but it carried weight. Authority. Ownership. The kind that could not be borrowed or performed. It could only be held. Daniel's chest tightened, not with panic, but with the slow, creeping awareness that he had misread everything. The room. The moment. Her. His earlier words replayed in his mind, each one sharper now, heavier, impossible to take back. The subtle chuckles, the condescension, the threat of security. Every detail returned with painful clarity. And now, surrounded by silence, they no longer sounded confident. They sounded exposed. A faint shift of movement from the gallery drew his attention, but no one spoke. They were watching, waiting, witnessing. The difference now was not just what had happened, but who it had happened to. Evelyn straightened slightly, her posture aligning perfectly with the space she now occupied. There was no announcement, no explanation, no dramatic gesture. And yet, the truth was already there, undeniable, settling into every corner of the courtroom. Daniel's confidence did not collapse all at once. It unraveled, thread by thread, as the weight of the moment pressed in. He opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, perhaps to correct himself, but no words came. Because somewhere deep down, he already knew. And the room knew it too. The silence stretched, unbroken, until even the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into the room like something heavy enough to be felt, not just heard. Daniel Brooks stood frozen, his mind no longer racing but slowing in a way that made every realization sharper, more precise, more unforgiving. Evelyn Carter did not rush the moment. She allowed it to exist, to stretch, to let every person in that courtroom arrive at the same understanding without a single word being forced. That was the difference. Power did not need to announce itself. It revealed itself. The clerk finally moved first, her voice careful, almost reverent as she spoke the words that confirmed what the room already knew. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Evelyn Carter presiding. The words landed with quiet finality. A shift moved through the room, subtle but undeniable. People adjusted their posture, their expressions tightening, their attention sharpening. Respect, immediate and complete. Daniel felt it too, but for him it was different. It was not just respect. It was consequence. His earlier confidence now felt distant, like something that belonged to another version of himself only minutes ago. He straightened instinctively, but the movement felt hollow, as if his body was trying to perform a role that no longer fit. Evelyn took her seat behind the bench, her movements controlled, unhurried, her presence anchoring the entire room. From that position, everything aligned around her. Perspective shifted. Authority settled into place. And from where Daniel stood, there was no escaping it. He lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, forcing himself to meet the moment. But this time, there was no audience to impress, no advantage to claim. Only the quiet weight of what had already happened. Evelyn opened the case file in front of her, her fingers moving with familiarity, precision, as if nothing unusual had occurred. That was the most unsettling part. She was not reacting. She was proceeding, as if his words, his tone, his actions had already been measured and placed exactly where they belonged. "Counsel," she said calmly, her voice even, professional, carrying across the room. Without effort, Daniel stepped forward slightly, the movement automatic, trained, but there was a hesitation now, barely noticeable yet impossible to ignore once seen. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, the words catching just enough to betray the shift inside him. A faint pause followed. Not long, not dramatic, but enough. Enough for the room to feel it. Enough for him to feel it. Evelyn's eyes lifted from the file and settled on him again. Not harsh, not forgiving, simply clear. "Before we proceed," she said, her tone unchanged, "I want to clarify something." The room stilled even further, if that was possible. Every breath seemed measured, every movement restrained. Daniel felt the weight of those words before she even finished the sentence. His grip tightened slightly at his side, invisible to most, but not to him. Not now. "This courtroom operates on respect," Evelyn continued, her voice steady, deliberate. "Not based on appearance, not based on assumption, but based on conduct." Each word landed with quiet precision. No raised voice, no visible anger. And yet, there was no mistaking who those words were meant for. Daniel's jaw tightened subtly. He did not interrupt. He could not. Because for the first time since he had entered that room, he was not in control of the narrative. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment longer, just long enough for the message to settle completely. Then, without shifting her tone, without adding emphasis, she returned her attention to the file in front of her. "You may proceed," she said. And just like that, the moment moved forward. But nothing about it was the same. Daniel began to speak, presenting his case as he had done countless times before, his voice steady, his words structured, but beneath it all, something had changed. Every sentence now carried awareness. Every pause, wait, because the room had not forgotten. And neither had he. The polished confidence he once relied on had been replaced by something quieter, more careful, more deliberate. Not out of strategy, but out of necessity. Across the room, Evelyn listened, her expression composed, her posture unwavering, her presence constant. She did not need to remind anyone. What had just happened? The silence had already done that. And as the proceedings continued, one truth settled into every corner of that courtroom, unspoken yet undeniable. Respect, once lost in a moment, does not return through words. It is rebuilt through understanding. And that understanding had just begun. Daniel Brooks continued speaking, his voice steady on the surface, but beneath it there was a precision now that had not been there before, as if every word had to pass through a filter of awareness before being allowed to exist. The courtroom listened, not with the casual attention from earlier, but with a sharper focus, a quiet curiosity that had replaced the earlier amusement. Something had shifted permanently, and everyone could feel it. Evelyn Carter sat composed behind the bench, her eyes occasionally lifting from the file, observing, not interrupting, not reacting, but always present. That presence alone was enough to keep the room aligned. Daniel moved through his argument carefully, citing details, referencing timelines, building his case piece by piece, but there was no performance in it anymore. The confidence that once pushed him forward had been replaced by discipline, by restraint. and the difference was noticeable. A faint creak from one of the wooden benches echoed as someone adjusted their position, but no one spoke. Even the smallest sound carried weight now. The courtroom was no longer a stage. It was a space where every action mattered. Daniel reached a point in his argument where he would normally pause, lean into the moment, and emphasize his authority, but this time, he did not. Instead, he simply continued, his tone even, his delivery controlled. Across the room, a senior attorney seated in the gallery watched closely, his expression unreadable but attentive. Others exchanged brief glances, not out of distraction, but out of recognition. They were witnessing something subtle, but significant. Not a collapse, but a recalibration. Evelyn closed the file in front of her gently, the soft sound drawing just enough attention to reset the room's focus. She leaned back slightly, her posture still composed, her expression neutral, but her attention fully engaged. "Counsel," she said, her voice calm, carrying without force. "You may proceed to your next point." There was no criticism in her tone, no indication of impatience, but there was clarity, direction. Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging, adjusting his stance, his shoulders settling into a more grounded position. He turned a page in his notes, but this time, he did not rush. He allowed himself a brief pause, not out of hesitation, but out of intention. The kind of pause that comes when someone understands the weight of the moment they are in. As he continued, his words became more precise, less decorative, focused entirely on substance rather than impression. It was a different kind of authority, quieter, but more real. The kind that did not demand attention, but earned it. Evelyn watched, her gaze steady, her silence purposeful. She did not need to correct him. The moment had already done that. The earlier exchange lingered in the air, not as tension, but as a reminder. A line that had been crossed, and then clearly drawn again. Daniel reached the conclusion of his point and lowered his notes slightly, waiting, not for approval, but for response. Evelyn allowed a brief silence to settle, just long enough to acknowledge the shift that had taken place. Then she spoke. "Thank you, counsel," she said, her tone even, professional, but with a subtle weight that made the words land differently than they would have before. Not just acknowledgement, but recognition. The room remained still, attentive, present. The energy had changed, not dramatically, but completely. What had started as a display of control had transformed into something far more meaningful. A demonstration of understanding. A reminder that authority is not defined by how loudly it is asserted, but by how quietly it is held. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, measured, almost unnoticed, but it marked a transition. Not back to what he had been, but forward into something else. Something more aware. Something more careful. And as the proceedings continued, one truth settled deeper into the room, unspoken but undeniable. The most powerful moments are not the ones where someone wins loudly, but the ones where everything changes without a single raised voice. And in that courtroom, change had already taken hold. The rhythm of the courtroom settled into something steady, almost measured like a quiet pulse that everyone could feel, but no one dared to interrupt. Daniel Brooks continued, his voice now refined by awareness, each word chosen with intention rather than impulse. The earlier edge in his tone had softened, replaced by clarity and restraint. It was not weakness. It was adjustment. Across the room, the audience remained still, their attention fixed not only on the case being presented, but on the subtle transformation unfolding in front of them. Evelyn Carter listened without interruption, her posture composed, her gaze steady, her presence anchoring the entire room in a way that required no effort. When Daniel finished his next argument, he did not rush into the next point. Instead, he allowed a brief pause, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the space he now understood differently. Evelyn nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any spoken praise. "Call your witness," she said calmly. The instruction was simple, but it shifted the flow of the room once again. Daniel turned, signaling toward the side door, and within moments, a witness stepped forward, escorted to the stand. The soft sound of footsteps echoed across the floor, followed by the quiet rustle of fabric as the witness took their seat. The clerk administered the oath, her voice steady, though there was still a trace of the earlier tension lingering beneath it. As the questioning began, Daniel's approach remained measured. He did not dominate the exchange. He guided it. His tone was respectful, his pace controlled, his focus precise. Each question was direct, each response carefully acknowledged. The courtroom listened, not just to the content, but to the way it was delivered. This was not the same attorney who had entered the room earlier, and everyone knew it. Across from him, opposing counsel observed closely, their earlier readiness to challenge now replaced with a more calculated patience. They had seen the shift too. They understood that something had changed, and that change altered the dynamic of everything that followed. Evelyn's eyes moved between the speaker and the witness, attentive, thoughtful, never distracted. She did not interrupt unless necessary, and when she did, her voice carried the same calm authority that had redefined the room from the moment she took her seat. At one point, the witness hesitated, their voice faltering slightly under the weight of the attention. Daniel paused immediately, allowing space, not pressing, not forcing. It was a small moment, but it mattered. Evelyn noticed. The room noticed. Respect, once absent, was now present in every detail. The questioning continued, each exchange building toward clarity, toward understanding, toward resolution. The earlier tension had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something more productive, more grounded. When Daniel concluded his examination, he stepped back slightly, signaling completion without unnecessary emphasis. "No further questions, Your Honor," he said, his tone even, composed. Evelyn gave a slight nod, her attention shifting to the opposing counsel. "Your witness," she said. The process continued, but the energy remained consistent, steady, controlled. There were no raised voices, no dramatic interruptions, no attempts to reclaim lost ground through force. Instead, there was discipline, awareness, growth unfolding in real time. As the proceedings moved forward, the earlier moment of misjudgment lingered not as a source of tension, but as a quiet lesson embedded into the structure of everything that followed. Daniel stood differently now, not just physically, but mentally. He listened more closely. He responded more thoughtfully. And in doing so, he began to rebuild something that had been lost in a single careless moment. Not his reputation, not yet, but his understanding. Evelyn observed it all without commentary, without acknowledgement, because none was needed. The courtroom itself had already delivered the message. And as the session progressed toward its final stages, one truth became clearer with every passing second. Respect is not restored through apology alone. It is demonstrated through action, through consistency, through the willingness to change when the moment demands it. And in that room, under the quiet authority of a judge who never needed to raise her voice, that change was happening, one measured step at a time. The courtroom had settled into a rhythm so controlled it almost felt deliberate, as if every person inside understood they were part of something larger than a simple proceeding. Daniel Brooks stood with a steadiness that had not been there before, but beneath that steadiness was awareness, constant and unrelenting. Every word he spoke now carried the memory of the moment that had changed everything. Across from him, opposing counsel continued their questioning, their tone measured, their strategy careful, but even they seemed to operate within the boundaries that had been silently redrawn. Evelyn Carter remained composed behind the bench, her presence unchanged, her attention unwavering. She listened not just to the words being spoken, but to the intent behind them, the subtle shifts in tone, the pauses that revealed more than any statement could. When objections arose, they were handled quickly, efficiently, without theatrics. A single raised hand, a calm statement, and Evelyn's response followed with clarity. Sustained. Overruled. Each decision delivered without hesitation, without excess, and with a precision that left no room for confusion. The room moved with her rhythm. It always had. It just had not been noticed until now. Daniel adjusted his stance slightly, his posture no longer rigid, but balanced. He was no longer trying to control the room. He was working within it. That difference, subtle as it was, defined everything that followed. A document was presented, its details examined, its relevance questioned. Voices remained steady, controlled, respectful. Even the witness, who had earlier shown signs of nervousness, now spoke with more confidence, as if the structure of the room itself provided stability. At one point, a brief pause settled in again, not out of uncertainty, but out of consideration. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly on the bench, her gaze focused. "Counsel," she said, her tone calm, but carrying a quiet emphasis, "clarify your point." It was not a correction. It was guidance. Daniel responded immediately, his explanation concise, direct, free of unnecessary elaboration. He did not overreach. He did not attempt to impress. He simply addressed the question. And in doing so, he demonstrated something far more valuable than confidence. He demonstrated understanding. The room remained attentive, every person aware that what they were witnessing extended beyond the case itself. It was a shift in behavior, in perception, in presence. The earlier moment of misjudgment had not been erased. It had been transformed into something else, a foundation for change. As the final arguments approached, the atmosphere grew quieter, more focused. This was where clarity mattered most. Daniel stepped forward, his notes in hand, but he barely glanced at them. His voice carried, steady and grounded, each word placed with care. He presented his closing not as a performance, but as a reflection of the facts, the testimony, the structure that had been built throughout the proceeding. There was no excess, no attempt to dominate, only purpose. Across the room, Evelyn listened, her expression unchanged, but her attention complete. When he finished, he did not linger. He stepped back, allowing the moment to settle. Opposing counsel followed, delivering their own closing with equal restraint, the tone of the room guiding their approach whether they realized it or not. When both sides had concluded, silence returned. Not empty, but full. Full of everything that had taken place. Evelyn allowed it to remain for a moment longer, then spoke. "The court will take this matter under advisement." Her voice was calm, final, carrying the authority of a decision not yet spoken, but already respected. The gavel did not need to strike. The room understood. Chairs shifted quietly as people prepared to leave, but no one rushed. The energy lingered, thoughtful, reflective. Daniel gathered his materials slowly, his movements deliberate, his expression composed but different. Not diminished. Changed. He paused for a brief moment, his gaze lifting toward the bench where Evelyn remained seated. She did not look at him directly, but her presence was enough. Enough to remind him of what had happened. Enough to ensure it would not be forgotten. And as he turned to leave, blending once again into the movement of the room, one truth followed him, steady and undeniable. The most powerful lessons are not the ones spoken loudly. They are the ones felt in silence, long after the moment has passed. The courtroom slowly began to empty, but the silence did not leave with the people. It lingered in the air, embedded in the walls, carried in the measured footsteps that echoed across the polished floor. Daniel Brooks moved with the crowd, his briefcase in hand, his posture composed, but his thoughts far from settled. Conversations began to rise in low murmurs around him, fragments of observation, quiet reflections, but none loud enough to break the weight of what had just occurred. He passed by colleagues who normally would have greeted him with nods of recognition or casual remarks. But today, their expressions were different. Not judgmental, not mocking, but aware. As if they had witnessed something that required silence rather than commentary. Daniel stepped into the hallway just outside the courtroom, the shift in space noticeable immediately. The controlled stillness of the courtroom gave way to a softer hum of activity, footsteps, distant voices, the subtle rhythm of a building that never truly stopped moving. He paused for a moment, standing near one of the tall windows that overlooked the city streets below, sunlight filtering through the glass, casting long reflections across the marble floor. For a brief second, he allowed himself to breathe without structure, without performance, without the constant calculation that had once defined his presence. But even in that moment, the memory remained clear. Every word he had spoken earlier replayed in precise detail, not distorted, not exaggerated, but exactly as it had happened. And now, without the shield of confidence, those words felt heavier. Not because they had been challenged loudly, but because they had been met with something far more powerful. Composure. Behind him, the courtroom doors opened again with a quiet creak, and the soft sound of footsteps followed. Daniel did not turn immediately, but he knew who it was before he even looked. Evelyn Carter stepped into the hallway, her presence as steady outside the courtroom as it had been within it. She carried no visible sign of authority now beyond her posture, her calm, her awareness. No robe, no elevated bench, no formal structure to define her role, and yet, nothing about her felt diminished. If anything, the absence of those symbols made her presence even clearer. Daniel turned slowly, meeting her gaze for the first time since the session had ended. There was a pause, brief but complete, where neither of them spoke. The hallway noise seemed to fade slightly, not because it had stopped, but because the moment between them carried its own focus. Daniel opened his mouth, as if to speak, but hesitated. For someone who had built a career on words, on precision, on control, this hesitation was unfamiliar. But it was honest. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than it had been earlier, stripped of projection, grounded in something more real. "Your Honor," he began, then stopped, the formalities suddenly feeling incomplete for what he intended to say. He adjusted slightly, not physically, but in tone. "Ms. Carter," he corrected, his words careful, deliberate. He paused again, searching not for the right phrase to impress, but for the right words to mean something. "I misjudged the situation." It was not an elaborate apology. It was not defensive. It was simple, direct. Evelyn listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, taking in the words without reacting to them immediately. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was measured, intentional. She allowed the moment to settle, just as she had done in the courtroom, giving weight to what had been said without rushing to respond. When she did speak, her voice carried the same calm clarity that had defined every word she had spoken that day. "You misjudged more than the situation," she said, not harshly, not accusingly, but truthfully. The words landed with precision, not as a reprimand, but as a statement of fact. Daniel nodded slightly, accepting it, not resisting, not explaining. Because he understood. For the first time that day, completely. Evelyn continued, her tone steady. "But what matters is what you do after that moment." She did not elaborate further. She did not instruct. She did not lecture. She simply placed the responsibility where it belonged. With him. Another brief silence followed, but this one felt different. Not heavy, not tense. Open. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, but carrying a sense of release. "I understand," he said quietly. And this time, there was no performance behind it. Evelyn gave a small nod, acknowledging the response, not as approval, but as recognition. Then, without further words, she turned and continued down the hallway, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, moving forward without looking back. Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, watching as she disappeared into the flow of the building, her figure blending into the everyday movement of people who would never fully understand what had just taken place. And as he stood there, one realization settled deeper than any argument he had ever made. Respect is not proven in moments of control. It is revealed in moments of humility. And that day, in a quiet courtroom, he had finally seen the difference. The hallway returned to its usual rhythm, but for Daniel Brooks, nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. The sounds of footsteps, distant conversations, and the low hum of activity blended into the background, but his focus remained fixed on the moment that had just passed. He adjusted his grip on his briefcase, not out of necessity, but as if grounding himself in something familiar. Around him, people moved with purpose, clerks carrying files, attorneys reviewing notes, assistants exchanging quiet updates, yet there was a subtle difference in the way a few of them glanced in his direction. Not with judgment, not with ridicule, but with quiet recognition. They had seen it. They had all seen it. And in a place where reputation traveled faster than words, moments like that did not disappear. They settled. Daniel began walking down the corridor, his pace measured, his posture composed, but his mind active in a way it had not been before. Each step echoed lightly against the marble floor, the sound steady, consistent, almost reflective of the internal shift taking place. He passed a group of younger attorneys gathered near a conference room, their voices low, their expressions focused, but as he moved past them, one of them paused briefly, offering a small nod. It was not admiration. It was not dismissal. It was something else. Respect, but not for what he had done earlier. Respect for how he had responded after. Daniel acknowledged the gesture with a slight nod of his own, continuing forward without breaking stride. The elevator at the end of the hall opened with a soft chime, and he stepped inside, joining two others already there. The confined space carried a different kind of silence, one that did not require attention, but still held awareness. The doors closed smoothly, and for a few seconds, no one spoke. Daniel's reflection stared back at him from the polished metal surface, his expression calm, but different. The sharp edge of confidence had softened into something more grounded, more aware. He studied it briefly, not with pride, not with regret, but with understanding. When the elevator reached the ground floor, the doors opened again, revealing the lobby filled with natural light streaming through tall glass windows. The city outside moved with its usual energy, cars passing, people walking, the constant motion of a world that did not pause for individual moments. Daniel stepped out, merging into that movement, but carrying something with him that would not be left behind. Outside, the air felt different, open, expansive, the sounds of traffic and distant conversations creating a contrast to the controlled environment he had just left. He paused briefly at the top of the steps, looking out at the street below, the sunlight reflecting off passing cars, casting shifting patterns across the pavement. For a moment, he simply stood there, not thinking about the case, not reviewing arguments, not preparing for the next move, just present. Behind him, the courthouse. Doors opened again, and a few people exited, their conversations light, their focus already shifting to whatever came next in their day. Life continued. It always did. But for Daniel, the weight of the earlier moment remained, not as something heavy, but as something clear, something defined. He descended the steps slowly, each movement steady, deliberate, his mind no longer searching for justification or explanation. That phase had passed. What remained was understanding. As he reached the sidewalk, he adjusted his jacket slightly, a small, almost habitual gesture, but even that felt different now. Not an attempt to project confidence, but simply a return to balance. A car passed by, the reflection of sunlight briefly catching the glass, and in that fleeting moment, Daniel saw his own reflection again, not in perfect detail, but enough. Enough to recognize the change. He began walking, blending into the flow of pedestrians, just another figure moving through the city, but internally, the shift was undeniable. The lesson had not been loud. It had not been dramatic. It had not required confrontation or force. It had been delivered through silence, through presence, through a moment that revealed more than any argument ever could. And as he moved forward, one thought remained steady, clear, and impossible to ignore. The way you treat someone when you believe they have no power says more about you than anything you say when you think they do. And that truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. The city carried on around him, indifferent to the quiet transformation that had taken place within one man, but Daniel Brooks no longer moved through it the same way. The rhythm of traffic, the distant sound of horns, the steady flow of pedestrians along the sidewalks all felt sharper now, more defined, as if he were seeing it through a clearer lens. He walked several blocks without rushing, his pace steady, his posture relaxed, not driven by urgency, but guided by reflection. Every few steps, the memory returned, not as something to avoid, but as something to understand. The courtroom, the silence, the moment he realized who she truly was. But more than that, the moment he realized who he had been before that realization. That was the part that stayed with him. He reached a crosswalk and paused as the light shifted, watching as cars slowed to a stop, their motion controlled, predictable. A small detail, but it held meaning now. Structure, order, respect for something greater than individual momentum. When the signal changed, he stepped forward with the others, blending into the flow, yet fully aware of each step. Later that afternoon, Daniel found himself back in his office, a space that had once represented control, precision, and authority. The large desk, the neatly arranged case files, the framed certificates on the wall, all of it remained exactly as it had been that morning. But the way he saw it had changed. He set his briefcase down gently, not dropping it onto the desk as he might have before, but placing it with intention. He loosened his tie slightly, not out of discomfort, but as if releasing the final remnants of a version of himself that no longer fit. He walked to the window, looking out over the city skyline, the buildings standing tall, unmoved by the events of a single day, yet somehow connected to everything that had unfolded. His reflection stared back at him faintly in the glass, not as a symbol of status, but as a reminder of identity. He studied it for a moment, not critically, not defensively, but honestly. There was no need to rewrite what had happened. No need to justify it. The truth was already clear. And clarity, once achieved, does not require repetition. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. One of his colleagues stepped in, pausing just inside the doorway. There was a brief moment where words could have filled the space, where questions could have been asked, where commentary could have been offered. But instead, the colleague simply gave a small nod. Not one of curiosity, not one of judgment, just acknowledgement. Daniel returned the nod, equally simple, equally understood. No explanation was needed. When the door closed again, the room returned to its quiet state, but it did not feel empty. It felt settled, grounded. Daniel moved back to his desk, opening one of the files, reviewing the details with a level of focus that came not from habit, but from intention. The work itself had not changed, but the way he approached it had. Every name, every document, every case represented people, not just positions. And that understanding reshaped everything. As the day moved into evening, the light outside softened, casting long shadows across the office floor. Daniel closed the file in front of him, not because the work was finished, but because something else had reached completion. A shift, a realization, a boundary that had been crossed and then redrawn with clarity. He stood, gathering his things, preparing to leave. But before he did, he paused once more, his gaze resting briefly on the empty chair across from his desk. A simple chair, unremarkable, yet now it carried meaning. A reminder that you never truly know who is sitting across from you. And more importantly, you never know who they might be when the moment reveals itself. Daniel turned off the light and stepped out of the office, closing the door quietly behind him. The hallway was calm, the building settling into the slower pace of evening, but his steps remained steady, purposeful. He did not need to look back. The lesson did not belong to the past. It moved forward with him. And as he walked out into the fading light of the day, one truth remained, quiet but unshakable. Respect is not given based on titles, appearances, or assumptions. It is revealed through how you treat others when you believe no one is watching. And on that day, in a silent courtroom, the world had quietly remembered what dignity looks like.